Recently, I was invited to give a presentation on photogrammetry and 3D scanning applications in physics and engineering, specifically medical physics. So, from some of my previous works, you may know I've got an interest in photogrammetry and Blender for scientific applications. A while back, I was fortunate enough to be able to showcase some of my research for the Blender Is video that was released by the Blender Foundation as part of the release of Blender 3.0. So I was able to give some quick snippets just showing some of my research activities using Blender and photogrammetry. So this presentation is going to be a more in-depth look at some of that research. It's not going to be like some of my previous videos, but a few of you in the comments expressed some interest in some of the scientific applications of photogrammetry. So this presentation might be of some interest to you. It's going to cover topics like photogrammetry, structured light scanning, LiDAR, neural radiance fields, and some of the applications of that for physics and medicine. So I hope you find it interesting, and feel free to leave any comments at the end of the video. Thanks, and hope you enjoy it. Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Michael Douglas, and I'd like to thank the EPSM Organising Committee for inviting me to speak to you today about how the developments of the Metaverse are benefiting medical physics and radiation oncology. For those of you familiar with the development of the Metaverse, you might be wondering, how are the Metaverse and medical physics related? Well, let's start with a definition. So Wikipedia defines the Metaverse as a hypothetical iteration of the internet as a single, universal, and immersive virtual world that is facilitated by the use of virtual reality and augmented reality headsets. Or as I like to think of it, it's a new iteration in how we interact and communicate online, whether that be for work-related meetings, social events, engineering and design, lectures, shopping, entertainment, or gaming. So in the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen big advances from the gaming industry, mainly through the development of GPUs. And these GPUs have ended up benefiting other areas of science and medicine. And one area in particular that we've seen benefits in radiation oncology because of this is through deep learning, and particularly deep learning segmentation and machine learning for automated treatment planning. We're also seeing advances in dose calculation algorithms, and these high-speed GPUs are resulting in accelerated dose calculations, which are helping to optimize our treatment planning efficiency. Similarly, the revolution from the metaverse has led to the development of, for example, augmented reality and virtual reality headsets, and we can use these to help guide patients and coach them for breath hold techniques in radiation therapy. We've also seen developments of 3D scanning technologies, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Surface-guided radiation therapy, which uses surface scanning techniques. And because of the developments in the metaverse, we're seeing cost-effective optical 3D scanning technologies like LiDAR, structured light scanning, and photogrammetry, and many of these are available on modern smartphones. So as I said, developments of augmented and virtual reality headsets are benefiting radiation oncology because we can use these to coach patients during breath hold techniques, and that allows for more reproducible breathing patterns, because they can monitor their own breathing against their baseline and they can adjust it accordingly. We're also seeing improved patient compliance because the patient can adjust the breathing themselves without getting manual feedback from the radiation therapists. Probably the biggest development, and it's becoming quite popular now, is surface-guided radiation therapy. And this uses optical scanning technologies to monitor the patient's position in real time to make sure that they're in the correct position. It results in a quicker and more accurate patient setup because the therapists who are setting up the patients have visual feedback of the patient setup position compared with the baseline at CT, and this enables them to set up the patient more rapidly. And we can also monitor the patient position in real time, and we can do this without any additional imaging dose because it uses optical technologies. So what are some of the new developments from the metaverse that we're seeing implemented in radiation oncology? So probably the biggest developments resulting from the metaverse are improvements to smartphone technologies, or as I like to call it, the tricorder, because it is the ultimate scientific instrument in your pocket. It has so many sensors, including high quality cameras, facial recognition scanners, gyroscopes, compass, ambient light sensor, proximity sensors, thermometers, barometers, various AI features, microphones, wireless technology, high performance processors, and optical surface scanners, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So, optical surface scanning is a means of acquiring scans of everyday objects and creating a 3D model of them. And this technology is benefiting lots of different industries. For example, creating 3D models for visual effects and movies so that conventional modeling techniques don't have to be used to model all these objects for movies, and they can just use a scanning device. You can imagine it'd be quite useful for educational purposes as well, because you can scan a landmark or something, and students can immerse themselves with virtual reality headsets, and they can walk around these objects. You can think it might be useful for real estate. You can scan houses and send a floor plan or a full 3D model of that house. It's also useful for engineering, so reverse engineering objects, scanning crime scenes for forensics, scanning archaeological dig sites, and also medicine, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So one of the most common kinds of optical scanning technologies that we're seeing in modern day smartphones is structured light scanning, and this is most commonly used for facial recognition. So when you hold your phone up to your face, it'll use a structured light scanning technology to scan the shape of your face, and it will compare that to a baseline, and if they match, then it will unlock the phone for you. The way this works is it projects a structured light pattern, or like a known light pattern, onto your face, and the distortion of that grid when it's projected onto your face can be used to reconstruct the 3D shape. So the way this works is you project a known light pattern. If you project this on a flat surface, it'll be undistorted. But then if you project it onto a 3D object, when it's viewed from the direction of the light source, you'll see again it's undistorted. But if you were to offset the camera, which is monitoring this light pattern, you can map these distortions and reconstruct the 3D object that caused the distortions. The next kind of technology, which has recently been added to several smartphones, is LiDAR. So you might be familiar with this technology for topographical scans. So planes flying over with lasers directed towards the ground. It emits a light pulse and measures the time it takes to return back to the plane. And you can use that to estimate the distance, and you can generate high quality topographical scans. But it's recently been added to smartphones, and this smartphones emit like a grid of spots, infrared grid of spots, and you can use this by measuring the phase shift in this case to estimate the distance to the smartphone, and this enables pretty much real-time 3D scans. So here's a video of the LiDAR grid pattern emitted from an iPhone 13 Pro. You can see it's being emitted from the back of the phone, and by scanning the phone around the object, you can use this data to estimate the 3D shape of the model that you're trying to scan. Here's an example of a 3D scan that I performed using my iPhone of the rando anthropomorphic phantom. And you can see it's just as easy as just pressing start and walking around the object. And after the reconstruction is complete, in a few seconds, you get a 3D scan. And the other more commonly used three-dimensional reconstruction technique is called photogrammetry, and this has been around in one form or another for quite a long time. And the idea is you just take photos of the object you're trying to scan from different angles, different heights, and basically covering the entire surface of the object. And the photogrammetry reconstruction algorithm uses the relative or the apparent motion of the object with respect to the camera angles after it's reconstructed them to estimate the 3D structure of the object. And what you get is a 3D model of that object with the color texture information on top. So here's just an example of a reconstruction process. So here it's showing the reconstructed camera positions, those little white dots, and the estimated 3D surface from those photographs. And then you've also got the option to add textual information. So you can see you can reconstruct the full color 3D model from just the photographs. And this can produce some very high quality scans. And the other kind of 3D scanning technology that I want to touch on is neural radiance fields. So this is a relatively new technique. It was first published in the literature in 2020. Neural radiance fields, or NERFs, as they're more commonly referred to, use fully connected neural networks to represent and render realistic 3D scenes based on a collection of 2D images. So the way this works is you train the neural network on a set of data with known camera poses, so the position of the camera and the angle that it was pointing, and the actual photograph from that direction. The fully connected neural network then learns the volume density and the directional radiance at any point in space. And once you've trained it, you're able to generate new photos from novel camera poses, so ones you haven't previously taken a photo of. So shown up here, you've got a collection of input images. You train the neural radiance field, and then you can generate 3D representations of the scene from camera angles you haven't taken before. So here's an example of training a neural radiance field in real time from some photogrammetry data I took from the rando anthropomorphic phantom. So you can see as time goes on, the neural network is being trained and it's getting a more and more accurate representation of the 3D scene. So you can see it's very quick, this reconstruction process. And eventually this technique, we're actually starting to see it now, but you'll be able to generate 3D models from this volume representation, which could conceivably be used for instead of photogrammetry. So you're probably wondering now, how does optical scanning fit in radiation oncology and how can it benefit radiation oncology? So back in 2019, myself and my colleague Alex, we looked at applications of photogrammetry in radiation oncology, and we were able to demonstrate that you could generate high-quality bolus or surface mold brachytherapy applicators using just a regular smartphone and open source photogrammetry software. So once we generated these 3D models, we were able to 3D print these bolus for use in clinical treatment plans. Here's just a few photos showing. On the left here, this is a rendered view of a plaster cast of a patient's arm, and this is a bolus, a test bolus that we created, and we were able to 3D print this. And we also experimented with different ways of generating catheter tunnels to generate surface mold brachytherapy applicators for skin cancer treatments. The same year, Michael Lecomte and other authors investigated the use of using an iPhone X true depth camera on the front of the iPhone at the time, and they were able to 3D scan the nose region of a human subject. And from this, they were able to 3D print a bolus from that scan. And they were able to compare the dosimetry that you could achieve from an electron beam between a pink bolus and the 3D printed bolus, and found that the dosimetry was equivalent. A few years later, my student, Corey, investigated different camera settings that we used a DSLR camera, and we optimized the camera settings to see what was the quality of the scan that we could get and how did these different camera settings affect the reconstruction quality. And we found the dominant factor that affected the reconstruction was image noise. So it was very important to have a well-lit room, having a low ISO setting on the camera, just to really improve these reconstructions. We also found reflective surfaces on the anthropomorphic phantom created some artifacts because it interferes with the reconstruction process. But there are various techniques to minimize reflections. In this case, we just used micropore tape applied to the reflective surfaces. But in general, we found that for real patients, it's not really a problem. It's just that rando has very reflective material. We also, as part of this study, proposed a workflow for generating surface mold brachytherapy applicators in an open source software called Blender. And we were able to achieve this with just using a standard DSLR camera and the open source software. And you can see here we have a CT-derived 3D printed applicator and a photogrammetry-derived 3D printed applicator, and the extruded catheter tunnels, which you can place the brachytherapy sources in. And this is just showing the process of making these boluses. So then we were able to 3D print the resulting CT and photogrammetry applicators, and we were able to generate some brachytherapy treatment plans for a bridge of nose site using both of these. And when we compared the dosimetry for these plants, found we were able to generate almost equivalent dose distributions, or equally good dose distributions, despite the larger air gaps on the photo-derived applicator. And it turns out this large air gap on the photogrammetry applicator was a limitation of the software that we were using at the time. And in general, the quality that you can achieve is much higher. So I'd just like to point out some of the amazing work that's being performed by Scott Crow and his research team. They're using a metrology grade structured light scanner to generate these amazing quality 3D scans of patients, which you could also then use to generate bolus surface mold applicators. Or here's just some examples showing the bolus from the nose region achieved using the structured light scanner. But I think what's most impressive about this study is that his team was able to generate a homogeneous synthetic CT scan, like a three-dimensional CT scan, which you could then import into the treatment planning system, and you could conceivably optimize treatment plans for some sites like total body irradiation or total skin electron therapy. And the same year, we published a study where we compared the reconstruction quality of CT, which is shown here on the left. In the middle, we show a LiDAR scan, and we investigated various photogrammetry softwares to see what the best quality was we could achieve. And we found that the reconstruction quality using certain softwares was far superior to that of CT. The spatial resolution is much higher. We also found LiDAR scanning from the iPhone was of a similar quality to CT. So from these studies, are we able to say that optical scans are useful for treatment planning? Well, we know they generate no ionizing radiation, so we can lower imaging dose of patients during their treatments. You get color textural information, which might help doctors delineate targets for treatment planning. And in general, you get very high spatial resolutions from optical scanning compared with CT imaging. But the one major limitation of optical scanning is you get no internal anatomical information of the patient, which is what you really need to estimate organ at risk dose or target dose. So can you really use optical scans for treatment planning if all you can get is a homogeneous representation of the external contour? So as it turns out, you can. So in our latest study, we decided to see if we could get any additional useful information from just an optical scan of a patient. And we did this by combining deep learning with optical scanning technologies. So this might enable you to plan treatments for certain sites without a CT or MRI. For example, total body irradiation or total skin electron therapy or surface brachytherapy. The big advantage of this is there's no imaging dose, and you could conceivably use this technique to augment an SGRT workflow to get additional information during treatments. So our proposed workflow for this technique was to take a 3D scan of a patient using photogrammetry or structured light scanning, for example, convert this 3D scan into a binary external mask representing the external surface of the patient, and then converting this external mask into a synthetic MRI image using a generative adversarial network. So we trained a two-dimensional generative adversarial network for 48 hours on an NVIDIA Quadro 4000 GPU. We trained it on 15,000 axial MRI slices and the corresponding external masks of healthy adult brains, which we got from an open source dataset. And to overcome the limitations of a 2D neural network, we encoded the axial slice position of each of the external masks as a pixel intensities in the binary mask. So the neural network had at least some idea where in the skull of the patient it was trying to predict the anatomy. So this graph here just shows the training process. So this is the external mask of a particular axial slice of the brain. And as we move towards the right, you can see as it sees more and more of the training data, the predictions of that particular slice are improving. So this is just for 2 epochs here out of about 40. So to validate the data set, validate the model, we used 5,000 axial MRI slices and external masks, and this data hadn't previously been seen by the model. And we compared these predictions with ground truth MRI images of the slices from that data set. We used a visual comparison just by using an image fusion between the prediction and the ground truth, just to look at the visual differences. To quantify these, we use the Multi-Scale Structural Similarity Index, or MSSI. We also got a expert radiologist to independently review the predictions to see what they thought. So now it's time to play MRI Bingo. So I've got 8 MRI slices here up on the screen. Some of them are synthetic, some of them are real MRI images. So we're just going to go from top left to bottom right and guess which of these are predicted and which are real images. So let's start with the top left. Take a moment to guess. This is in fact synthetic. The second one is real, synthetic, synthetic, real, synthetic, real, and synthetic. So quite amazingly, it's difficult to tell the difference between them just visually. But even more interestingly, if you compare the predictions and the ground truth MRI slices for a corresponding external slice, it's actually very difficult to see differences or major differences between the predictions. You can actually get a surprising amount of information. In a lot of cases, the differences are just due to differences in pixel intensity, which for the purposes of treatment planning isn't all that relevant because all you're really interested in is where the organs are, not so much what the pixel intensity is. But there's definitely examples where there are big anatomical differences, for example, here. But in some cases, you might argue that if you're only looking at like the normal tissue volume, then it's not really relevant. If you were to use a synthetic CT, you probably wouldn't see this anyway. So the multi-scale structural similarity index was used to quantify these differences. This is a metric that's commonly used in the TV industry to quantify differences in video quality between like compressed data and uncompressed video data. And it's been shown to correlate very well with human perceived similarities in images. So unlike the the mean square error or the mean absolute error, it quantifies structural information as well as pixel intensities. So it looks at the pixel intensities as well as like the grouping or the shapes or spatial correlation of different bits of the images. This graph's a histogram just showing the number of MRI slices in the validation data set and their corresponding MSSI. And you can see we have a mean MSSI of about 0.85, which is very good. A value of 1 indicates perfect structural similarity, or the images are absolutely identical. So it does give very accurate predictions. And finally, we got the head of neuroradiology at the Royal Adelaide Hospital to review the predictions from the model to see what he thought of these. If you want a more detailed explanation or description of his assessment, you can look at the paper, which I'll include the link to at the end of this presentation. But in summary, he said it was quite amazing, but obviously there are limitations in regions of the brain where there's a wide variation within the normal population. And finally, for this study, we took the trained model and we applied it to an optical scan of a human subject and predicted the axial slices for this 3D model. So you can see here from this is the most superior aspect of the brain to the most inferior, and these are the corresponding predictions. And you can see they look reasonably convincing, but I didn't have a corresponding ground truth MRI to compare it to, so this will have to be the subject of further research. And on here on the right, you can just see 3D renderings from these 2D slices, and I think it looks fairly convincing. So in summary, we trained a deep learning model to transform optical scans into synthetic MRI datasets. We used an open source MRI dataset of healthy adult brains, and we're able to take the external contours of those patients and convert them to MRIs using generative adversarial networks. We then validated the model, and we were able to achieve a multi-scale structural similarity index of 0.85. And surprisingly, you're able to get quite a good level of predictive accuracy from just the external contour of a patient. But obviously, cranial anatomy can vary in certain regions within the population, so there are uncertainties there. And then finally, we were able to apply this model to real photogrammetry data, and we demonstrated in principle optical scans can be used to estimate patient anatomy and perhaps get some extra anatomical information, which might make it suitable for treatment planning using optical scanning for some sites. So there are obvious limitations of this work. So we used a 2D generative adversarial model, which looks at or predicts it slice by slice. So because it's not aware of the neighboring slices, well, not much anyway, there's reduced continuity between slices. But the benefits of a 2D model are it's generally a lot faster to train and evaluate than a 3D model. And in some cases, it requires less data to train it on. One limitation, or something to investigate in the future, is as you can imagine, when you do an optical scan of a patient, it's going to scan their hair geometry. And when you feed this into the neural network, it's going to try and guess what's inside that hair volume. In this case, it normally adds normal tissue volume. And the reason for this is because I trained it on an MRI data set. I extracted the external mask from that data, which had no hair geometry. So in this study, it didn't know what to do with the hair, so it just placed normal tissue in there. So ideally, you need more data or a specialized data set that has a fusion between the optical scan data and the corresponding CT or MRI data so it can learn that connection and get rid of the hair. So obviously for other sites, you're going to need other training data, hopefully healthy anatomy, because if you don't, during the training process, the generative adversarial net will try and imagine or hallucinate fake tumors within the geometry, which you don't want, and it's obviously not real. And I think interestingly, in the future, we should look at how if you contour the organs at risk in the synthetic data set, how do those contours compare with the real data contours? So you can do it like a dosimetric assessment of can you actually do treatment planning with this. So for all of this, I think you'd need to perform a clinical study with specific data, so optical scan data and corresponding radiographic images. So I'd just like to finish by acknowledging the ACPSCM and the Better Healthcare Technology Foundation and the EPSM Organising Committee for inviting me to speak on this today. And I'd also like to thank my collaborators, Corey Bridger, Alex Santos, Paul Reish, Peter Goreski, and Sandy Patel for supporting this harebrained idea. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.